Tell us, how is it that you got brought into the profession that you held?
Well, while I was still in business school in 1968, the National Security Agency recruited me. And the way that happened was that I was married to a woman whose father was very high up in the Department of the Navy, and one of his best friends was very high up in the National Security Agency. So they offered to interview me for a job, and I went in and I spent a couple of days there, especially one very intensive period when I was under lie detector interviews. And during that period of time, they discovered many weaknesses in me. I have a lot of weaknesses. And they identified me as a good candidate for an economic hitman. And then I was sent into the Amazon rainforest by the Peace Corps. I went in the Peace Corps for a short period of time, 3 years actually, and went into the Amazon and worked with people who were very strongly opposed to what the oil companies are doing to the Amazon, indigenous people there in the Amazon. It was really part of my training. While I was still there, a vice president from a major international consulting firm came down, and who also had connections with the National Security Agency and knew that they had identified me and recruited me for this job, because economic hitmen work through private corporations, not directly for the government. That keeps everything much more secret, and it leaves the government out. The government cannot be implicated as long as this is being done through private consultants. The consulting firms, of course, are paid by the U.S. government as consulting firms, and people like me, then my salary was paid by this consulting firm. But it was very clear, it was very obvious to me what I was supposed to do, and after I agreed to join this effort, I was then trained by an amazing woman who's described in detail in Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Her name is Claudine, and she was very beautiful, very seductive, extremely talented, knew exactly what to do, knew all the hooks, knew all my weaknesses, and brought me in. You know, I like to think of myself as a good person at heart, and I grew up in a family in New Hampshire that came from over 300 years of Yankee Calvinists. We have very strong moral values, very principled, and I think I'm a really good case in point of how the system can seduce you, how there's three very powerful drugs in our lives these days: sex, money, and power. And I was seduced by all three of those.
So when you went into the Peace Corps, was that your own idea, or were you nudged in that direction? Well,
I'd been recruited by the National Security Agency, and while I was still in business school, I happened to go to a Peace Corps recruiting speech, and was quite taken by the recruiter. And I, as I mentioned, grew up in rural New Hampshire. I come from a long line of Yankees who killed Indians and made love with Indians and created children with them. And I'd always been fascinated by the Abenaki tribe, which I have a little bit of blood from, and always fascinated by Indian lore. And so as I heard this Peace Corps recruiter speak afterwards, I went up to him and I said, is there any possibility if I joined the Peace Corps, going to a place like the Amazon and living with people who live as our indigenous people did here 200-300 years ago? And he said, absolutely. Nobody wants to go to the Amazon. If you volunteer for that, I think you'll be sent there. And then I called this man who had recruited me at the National Security Agency, and I told him about this and told him I was torn because I wanted to go to the NSA, but I also was intrigued by this. He said, go. We'll make sure that you get into the Amazon. He said, that's where all the action is. These are the people who are opposing our oil companies. We need the Amazon for oil. This will be a great experience for you. When you come out, you can work for us.
And it was while you were down there that one of the representatives from the company that you would be working at showed up? Right.
I'd been there about 2 years. It's a 2-year assignment in the Peace Corps, but I'd extended for a third year because I really enjoyed it. And I was also not interested in going to Vietnam, and I had another year before I turned 26 and was no longer draftable. And after the second year, this gentleman showed up. He's talked about extensively in the book and named in the book, and told me he'd be interested in hiring me. And for a year after that, we corresponded. I wrote a lot of letters to him. He asked me a lot of questions about the economy of Ecuador. He was really testing me. He was checking me out. He was seeing where my loyalties were and whether I was able to write books on, reports on the economy of people and really check out the people. So I did that. I passed that test, and a year later he brought me up to Boston, where the headquarters of this company were, and recruited me.
But you had no sense of that at the time, that he was feeling you out for a potential job, or?
Oh yes, I certainly had an inkling of that. Yeah, it was very exciting to me to think that this was going on, because after all, when I talked to the man from the National Security Agency who originally arranged for my interviews and told him of my desire to go in the Peace Corps, he encouraged me. He was the one who said, you can always come to work for us afterwards. So I had a real strong sense that that's what was going on.
Okay, so you then came back and you joined this company, Chas T. Main?
Correct. And we called it Charles. It was spelled C-H-A-S, but Chas T. Main, we usually called it Main just for short. Right. Big. We had about 2,000 employees in Boston. It was what's called a closely held corporation, which means basically a partnership. About 5% of these 2,000 employees owned the company. They were what we call partners, and I became one of those eventually. I became chief economist of that firm, and I ended up having roughly 50 people working for me over time.
And what type of work does that company do?
Well, interesting. The company called itself an engineering construction firm, and we never did any real construction. We never owned any equipment, and in fact we prided ourselves on saying we're objective. We don't need to go into countries and tell them to build big systems, because we don't gain anything from it. We're not like Bechtel or Halliburton, Stone and Webster, any of the big construction companies. We don't do that. But the fact of the matter is, our job was to convince other countries to take very large loans, and then to convince the World Bank and other such organizations to give these countries huge loans, let's say $1 billion, to Ecuador, to build big infrastructure projects, power plants and transmission lines and distribution systems, ports, highways, industrial parks, things that didn't benefit anybody except the very wealthy people in those countries, who were quite corrupt, and we corrupted them. So our job was to convince, let's say, Ecuador to accept a $1 billion loan, convince the World Bank to give Ecuador a $1 billion loan. 90% of that $1 billion would come back to the United States to pay for Halliburton, Bechtel, these kinds of, or these types of companies, to build the infrastructure, and then which would only serve the wealthiest people in those countries. And then the country would be stuck with this huge debt, which over time would continue to be refinanced and get larger and larger and larger, so that in fact today Ecuador owes more than 50% of its national budget just to pay down its debt service, which means there's very little money left to go to pay for the education or health services for the poor people, who were the ones who suffered from these projects. It was their rivers that were destroyed as we built hydroelectric plants. It was their land that was destroyed, and while a few of their people got wealthy, as a few of ours did. So now they're saddled with this incredible debt that they can't possibly pay. And so we go in and demand our pound of flesh, very much like the mafia. That's why we called ourselves Hitman. And so today, for example, this is actually what's happened in Ecuador. And today, we need Ecuador's oil. We need the oil from this Amazon area where these indigenous people live that I worked with as a Peace Corps volunteer. And we tell Ecuador, since you can't pay off your loans, what you need to do is turn over your Amazon to our oil companies. And that's what they're doing. And the indigenous people there, the ones I worked with now, have basically declared war. They said, we're not allowing these oil companies to come in. We're going to fight to the very last man if we have to. It's a terrible situation, and what it is all about is building empire. We've done this in every country around the world that has resources that we covet. Often this is oil in places like Indonesia, Nigeria, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, so many different places, but sometimes it's other resources. For example, in Panama, it was the Panama Canal. And in this process, we've managed to create the largest empire in the history of the world, and we've done it largely without military might. It's been done primarily through economic hitmen like me. Now, when the economic hitmen fail, as we did in Panama with Omar Torrijos, and in Ecuador many years ago with Jaime Roldos when I was there, when we fail, the jackals are sent in. And these are CIA-sanctioned troublemakers. They will try to foment coups in a country. They'll try to overthrow the president. If they fail, if they're not able to do that, then they'll assassinate him. And Jaime Roldos of Panama, who was not overthrown, so he was assassinated. And Omar Torrijos Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, Omar Torrijos of Panama, the same thing happened. We economic hitmen failed. The jackals went in and assassinated these presidents. It happened with Allende in Chile, Arbenz in Guatemala. It's part of what Vietnam was about. And when the jackals fail and the economic hitmen both fail, as in Iraq, the final step is for us to send in our young men and women to die and to kill. And that's what we're doing in Iraq today.
All right, I want to back up a bit and go back to when you're a young man and you're being initially trained by Claudine. What was involved in that? How long did that take?
And Claudine's training of me took a number of months. There was about 9 months between the time when Maine hired me and I went on my first assignment to Indonesia. And Claudine was training me during a great deal of that time, on and off. All of my training occurred in this very plush apartment, small apartment, but very plush on Beacon Street in Boston. Our headquarters, Maine's headquarters, was the Prudential Center in Boston, and this was very close to there. It was never done in our offices. It was very, very clandestine. I would spend tremendous amounts of time at Claudine's apartment, and she seduced me in every possible way. I was very seducible. She was gorgeous. She was intelligent. She was sensual. She was an amazing woman. And at the same time, she told me in no uncertain terms what was to be expected of me as an economic hitman, and told me that, and she called it a dirty business. And she said, we need to make sure that you're totally comfortable doing this and going off and doing this. If you're not comfortable doing it, then don't do it. Don't go to Indonesia. Don't take on this assignment, because once you're in for life. You can't turn back. So part of her training of me was to seduce me into it, but at the same time make absolutely certain that I was buying into it, that I was going to be a part of it.
And it's your belief that she had access to the information that the NSA had gotten out of you during the polygraph tests?
Correct. I have no doubt about that. She knew what my weaknesses were. She zeroed right in on them. I grew up the son of a prep school teacher in a private school in New Hampshire, and lived on the campus all my life. My dad didn't get paid much money at all. Everything was free. Our house was free. Our food was free. The lawns were mowed for us. The snow plowed. Everything was free. So we lived a pretty decent life, but I never had any cash. And I was surrounded all my life by boys who came from very, very wealthy families all over the world. And I heard their stories. And then I went to school with these boys. And they would go home on vacation to Venezuela, to Caracas, to Beirut, to London, to wherever they were from, and I would be stuck in this little campus all by myself in Tilton, New Hampshire, and very lonely. I'd basically been rejected by the town, and I'd rejected the town because there was animosity between the townies and the preppies, and I saw myself as a preppy. So some of it was self-imposed. But these guys would come back from their vacations with these amazing stories to tell, you know, the debutante balls they'd been to, and the orgies, and you know, my life was so boring, and I developed this complex that I really wanted to excel, and I wanted to live that kind of a life. Then I went to Middlebury College, and much of the same there. There were a lot of wealthy people at Middlebury. So I had this desire, and I was extremely shy around women, incredibly shy around women, and pathetically shy around women. And I had this complex, and Claudine knew this. The NSA had identified this, and Claudine appealed to every side of it. You know, man, you know, it was just amazing. And then, as an economic hitman, I traveled always first class. I rode up in the bump of the 747s, you know, I was always first class. Stayed in the best hotels wherever I went, sometimes the best suites in the best hotels. Ate at the best restaurants, wined and dined around the world by people like the Shah of Iran and the presidents of various countries. I spent time with Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank. It was quite a life. It was everything I'd ever dreamed about having, really. It was the realization of my fantasy.